While military aviation really came into its own during the First World War, it was still incredibly dangerous. By most accounts, the life of a pilot on the Western Front was less than a matter of a few weeks. The U.S. 95th Aero Squadron, for example, was only on the front line for about 6 months, from May until November of 1918, and yet in that time it took 13 casualties among just 24 pilots, or the loss of a pilot less than once every 2 weeks. One of those, lost on July 14th, 1918, was a man that was known and beloved throughout the nation. The death of Quentin Roosevelt, the only son of a U.S. president to have died in combat, deserves to be remembered. Theodore Roosevelt became president after the death of President William McKinley in 1901. The elevation of the rambunctious hero of the war with Spain, at age 42 the youngest man ever to be inaugurated president, represented a novel problem. With 6 children at home, not to mention an almost comical menagerie of pets, the White House was simply not large enough to handle both family and the president's business, necessitating the construction of an addition that is today known as the West Wing. The president's children, ranging in age from Alice, only child of Roosevelt's first wife, age 17, to youngest Quentin, just 4 years old, became national celebrities. Independent-minded Alice became a fashion icon, although she was also often controversial owing to her headstrong independence, while the younger children were a matter of public fascination. Mischievous, they were known for roller skating in the newly renovated East Room. The White House Historical Association explains that they would hide behind vases and scare people. So Roosevelt might have the French ambassador visiting, and one of his sons might pop out from behind a vase and scare the French ambassador. Quentin, the youngest, was always a public favorite, literally growing up during the nearly 8 years his father spent in the White House. Precocious and mischievous, his mother Edith called him a fine, bad little boy. Presidential historian Feather Schwartz Foster notes that Quentin was particularly friends with Charlie Taft, son of Roosevelt's Secretary of War, William Howard Taft. Foster writes Charlie and Quentin were the same age and became boon companions. Quentin, along with older brother Archie and several other boys, including Roswell Pinckney, son of White House steward Henry Pinckney, became known as the White House Gang. A 1976 obituary for gang member Earl Looker explained, Quentin, who attended public grade school when his father was president, and his friends amused and delighted the American public. In 1929, Looker published a book on the boys' antics called The White House Gang, detailing numerous antics, often at the expense of White House staff and occasionally the president himself. The boys got into all sorts of antics. They threw snowballs at the Secret Service from the White House roof. Foster notes they borrowed trays from the kitchen and sledded down the back stairs. Once, when Archie was sick, Quentin snuck his pony, Algonquin, onto the White House elevator to cheer him up. The president was less than enthused when the boys carved a baseball diamond out of a White House lawn without permission, but was often part of their shenanigans. Foster writes if Archie and Quentin were the gang leaders, the supreme commander, albeit honorary, was the President of the United States himself, who, as his wife Edith frequently remarked, was her 7th and oldest child. He would often join the gang in games of hide-and-seek. Still, the president occasionally had to intervene. The Theodore Roosevelt Center writes, in 1908, TR caught the boys decorating Andrew Jackson's official portrait with well-placed spitballs. Eager to teach them a lesson about respecting the property of others, the president conducted a hastily arranged trial. And after finding the conspirators guilty, TR banished the gang members from the White House for 1 week. Portraits, recalled one gang member, were henceforth taboo. The public was enthralled, and the fine, bad little boy was often reported on in the newspapers. A 1908 story called him the most democratic juvenile in the Capitol because there is no disposition on his part or that of his fellow students to regard him in any other light than just a plain American boy. Another detailed his infatuation with a girl at the school, the daughter of a letter carrier. A 1907 story in the Kalamazoo, Michigan Gazette said of him, he is kind to old women and always keeps his promises. Not surprisingly, given his family's history, Quentin was interested in the military. Early on, he favored the Navy. He was often dressed in a sailor suit and was frequently seen with naval officers, but his interest would change. He had an aptitude for mechanics. His father wrote in a letter in 1911, Quentin is an affectionate, soft-hearted, overgrown puppy kind of a boy, absorbed in his wireless and in anything mechanical. Foster writes Quentin Roosevelt, who most resembled his father in looks, build, exuberance, leadership qualities, varied interest, and general intellect, had a talent all his own, mechanics. Growing up in the age of the airplane, He wanted to be an aerospace engineer. Quentin spent the summer of 1909 in Europe, where, among other experiences, he saw an airplane for the first time. In a letter to a friend, he wrote, "We are in Rams and saw all the airplanes flying and saw Curtis, who won the Gordon Bennett Cup for swiftest flight. You don't know how pretty it was to see all the aeroplanes sailing at a time. At one time there were 4 in the air. It was the prettiest thing I ever saw." He attended the Groton School in Massachusetts. His father had been a childhood friend of the school's founder, Endicott Peabody, and all 4 of Roosevelt's sons attended. Quentin became an editor of the school newspaper. He did well in school, but his personality showed through. When he received an academic award for being second in academic standing in his class, the New York Times quoted him, "That's nothing. I don't study hard. I don't believe in it. I want to be good at baseball and football much more than at my studies." It would have been a challenge. Like his father, Quentin suffered from asthma and was terribly nearsighted. And after an injury riding horseback in 1913, he had difficulty with back pain. His popularity continued after his father left office. A good student, he entered Harvard, his father's alma mater, in 1915 at the age of 19. There he met and fell in love with Flora Payne Whitney, an heiress to the Vanderbilt fortune. Roosevelt biographer Edward Renahan notes that her father did not approve of the younger Roosevelt. The two became engaged in 1917, but there wasn't time to get married. The young man that the public had seen grow up was off to war. Although removed from his presidency and largely a political outcast after splitting the vote with the third party run in the 1912 election, Theodore Roosevelt was a strong advocate for U.S. entry into the war in Europe. The National Park Service writes, "Far removed from the White House and the power of the presidency that was once his, Roosevelt believed America should prepare for war, training troops and readying the Navy, even if the nation were not directly involved in the fight. President Wilson preferred to keep America neutral, leaving a European conflict to the Europeans, declaring there's such a thing as a man being too proud to fight. Roosevelt believed neutrality would fail as the war developed. After the Germans sank the RMS Lusitania on May 7, 1915, Roosevelt regarded America's lack of involvement as inconceivable. The Library of Congress writes, as war loomed in Europe, Roosevelt became increasingly convinced that the United States needed to prepare for the advent of war and oppose those who spoke for peace at all costs. When the United States finally did join the war, he volunteered to serve abroad, but Wilson denied his request. Thwarted, Roosevelt turned his attention to campaigning for the war effort and sending his sons to serve in the war. Roosevelt said in a speech in 1917, "I have sent my 4 sons. I have sent over my 4 boys, for each of whose lives I care 1,000 times more than I care for my own." The National Park Service writes, "Instead, Roosevelt's 6 children took up the cause and served where and how they could. Ted and Archie left for France on June 20th, 1917, where Ted took command of the 1st Battalion of the 26th Infantry, 1st Division, with his younger brother under his command. The next month, Quentin, the youngest sibling, went over with the 95th Aero Squadron. Ethel and her husband Dick Derby went to Europe with the Red Cross, the organization to which they devoted their entire lives. Alice, wife to Nick Longworth, remained in Washington, D.C. to bear her considerable influence on politics at home and pass information to her father. Of Kermit, posted with the British Army in the Middle East, Theodore Roosevelt wrote, "The boy shall have the chance to serve, and if necessary, be killed in the serving." The same sentiment could apply for the rest of the family as well, for those qualities of valor and honor appealed to the Roosevelts and had been driven into the children their entire lives. Quentin volunteered for the Air Service on April 25, 1917, the same month the U.S. declared war. He was anxious enough to consider joining the Canadian Flying Corps, but his brother Kermit later wrote, upon confirmation of the rumor that an American flying school was to be started immediately, he decided that it would not be materially speeding up his entrance into active service by going to Canada. The White House Historical Association writes, "Quentin was a grown man going off to war, but he was still thought of as the baby of the family. According to one of his father's letters, on his last night at the Roosevelt home at Sagamore Hill, his mother tucked him into bed. He left Harvard as a sophomore and left Flora behind. The War Department refused to let her travel to Europe." Of course, Quentin wanted to fly, but the young man who thought aeroplanes the prettiest thing I ever saw had poor eyesight. Renahan writes that he got around the issue by memorizing the eye chart. In training, he did well. Kermit wrote that first his instructors and later his pupils agreed that Quentin was gifted with that sixth sense that singles out the born aviator. In Europe, he espoused the same democratic principles he had as a schoolboy. Fellow flyer Eddie Rickenbacker said of him, as President Roosevelt's son, he had a rather difficult task to fit himself in with the democratic style of living which is necessary in the intimate life of an aviation camp. Everyone who met him for the first time expected him to have the airs and superciliousness of a spoiled boy, This notion was quickly lost after the first glimpse one had of Quentin. Gay, hearty, and absolutely square in everything he said or did, Quentin Roosevelt was one of the most popular fellows in the group. We loved him purely for his own natural self. He had challenges. Flying was difficult. Accidents common. Presidential biographer David Pietruzza writes, in late March 1918, while still in training, Quentin cracked up his plane. I smashed it up beautifully, he wrote back home. It was a really very neat job, for I landed with a drift, touched one wing, and then, as there was a high wind, did 3 complete somersaults, ending up on my back. I crawled out with nothing more than a couple of scratches. He was as brave as you would expect. Rickenbacker wrote, he was reckless to such a degree that his commanding officers had to caution him repeatedly about the senselessness of his lack of caution. His bravery was so notorious that we all knew he would either achieve some great spectacular success or be killed in the attempt. Even the pilots in his own flight would beg him to conserve himself and wait for a fair opportunity for a victory. But Quentin would merely laugh away all serious advice. But he understood what was on the line. He continued writing while in France. In a story entitled The Greatest Gift, he wrote, "What is the greatest blessing, I mused, as I sat at my window? And the warm breath of spring, sweet with the scent of flowers and green things growing, whispered softly, life. Life is the greatest gift. To live and feel no fear, lest the grim hands that stays not smite. What higher hath the gods to give?" On July 10th, 1918, Quentin scored what would later be counted as an air victory. During a mission, he got separated from his group. He finally found them and settled into the last position in the formation when he found out that his eyesight had failed him. It was not his squadron's formation that he had joined. He reported, "They had been going absolutely straight, and I was nearly in formation when the leader did a turn, and I saw to my horror that they had white tails with black crosses on them. Still, I was so near by then that I thought I might pull up a little and take a crack at them. I had altitude on them, and what's more, they hadn't seen me. So I pulled up, put my sights on the end man, and let go. I saw my tracers going all around him, but for some reason he never even turned, until all of a sudden his tail came up and he went down in a spin. I wanted to follow him, but the other 2 had started around after me, so I had to cut and run." The website History on a Shirt remarks, Rickenbacker pictured the German intelligence office becoming very frustrated with the new tactic Americans were bringing to aviation, of flying in good German formation with the enemy for 15 minutes before shooting him down. 4 days later, on Bastille Day, 1918, fellow 95th Squadron pilot Lieutenant Edward Buford, Jr. reported, "About a half-mile away I saw one of our planes with 3 Boches on him, and he seemed to be having a pretty hard time with them, so I shook the 2 I was maneuvering with and tried to get over to him, but before I could reach him, his machine turned over on its back and plunged down out of control. I realized it was too late to be of any assistance." Lieutenant Quentin Roosevelt, a fine, bad little boy, had been hit twice in the head by German fire, likely by German ace Lieutenant Karl Thon. His plane crashed behind the German lines. When the Germans discovered his identity, they buried him with full honors and released a statement confirming his death. The ground was taken by the Allies a few days later, where the grave was found and an American service read over it. President Wilson wrote his political rival, "Am greatly distressed that the news of your son's death is confirmed. I had hoped for other news. He died serving his country and died with fine gallantry. I am deeply grieved that his service should have come to this tragic end." His parents released a brief statement. "Quentin's mother and I are very glad that he got to the front and had a chance to render some service to his country and show the stuff that was in him before his fate befell him." But privately, they grieved. Roosevelt wrote in September, "It is rather awful to know that he paid with his life, and that my other sons may pay with their lives, to try to put in practice what I preached. To feel one has inspired a boy to conduct that has resulted in his death has a pretty serious side for a father." Friends said that the president was never the same. On January 6th, 1919, not 6 months after Quentin's death, Theodore Roosevelt passed away in his sleep. Both Theodore Jr. and Archie were wounded in combat. Renahan contrasts the service of Roosevelt's sons with those of Kaiser Wilhelm II, whose 6 sons all served in safe staff positions well away from danger. Quentin Roosevelt is the only son of a U.S. president to have died in combat. Kermit and Theodore Jr. would both die in uniform during the Second World War, but neither due to enemy fire. The nation mourned for Quentin, perhaps the highest-profile American to die in the war, but the public memory is short, and heroes are quickly forgotten. The White House Historical Association writes, as the decades passed, Quentin's gravesite near Chambray began to deteriorate. The oak fencing erected by the French was not built to last forever, and it ultimately fell into disrepair. American visitors mostly stopped making the pilgrimage to the site. In 1955, Quentin's remains were moved to the American Cemetery at Colville-sur-Mer and interned next to Ted, a brigadier general who had died of a heart attack in 1944. The Historical Association writes, "The brothers now lie side by side in a field of identical white crosses." In 1921, Kermit Roosevelt wrote, "Quentin was not yet 21 when he was shot down. Still," he wrote, "years count for but little in the record of life." Does a death matter more if a man is famous? Does the death of the son of a president aggrieve the nation more than the death of the son of a postman or a steelworker or a farmer? Perhaps it shouldn't. But perhaps Quentin stands for them as well. At the time of his death, the St. Louis newspaper Reedy's Mirror wrote, "We think of gallant, modest Quentin as typical of all Americans. He stands for all of the fallen, upon whom no glory falls." I hope you enjoyed watching this episode of The History Guy, and if you did, please feel free to like and subscribe and share The History Guy with your friends. And if you also believe that history deserves to be remembered, then you can support The History Guy as a member on YouTube, a supporter on our community at Locals, or as a patron on Patreon. You can also check out our great merchandise shop, book a special message from The History Guy on Cameo.